Hello, and welcome to the Northern Ireland podcast with your host, Lily Busby. For this episode, I am joined by Emma DeSouza, a writer, peace builder, and a political commentator. Today, Emma will talk about some of her predictions for the new year. But firstly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Lily. Thanks so much. About myself, in terms of a quick overview of some of my work, I work in a couple of different areas. One is in political commentary and writing, which is across several publications, including the Irish Times, The Guardian, Byline Times, Open Democracy, and others. But I also work in civic society. So I lead an organization called the Civic Initiative, which is about trying to mobilize civic society and create a space for inclusive participatory democracy. And I also am the director of the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Programme with New York-based NGO NCAFP, which stands for the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Try getting that title into one business card. It is lengthy. So they're kind of my main areas of work. And in terms of a bit of personal information, I live in Fermanagh with my 4 dogs and cat and husband.
And what are your top 3 predictions for the North in 2024?
Well, I think that in 2024, we're going to see actually not even just unique to Northern Ireland, but a significant potential change in the political landscape across the UK and Ireland. This year, we're looking at having a general election in the UK, which will have an impact here in Northern Ireland in terms of representation. We're also looking at having an election in the Republic of Ireland as well, which could see a Sinn Féin government emerging from that. It is a year of elections. We also have the US presidential election, which is a factor here because we have this kind of coalescing of major elections happening across the UK, Ireland, and US, and also the EU in a way that hasn't happened since 1992. And that is significant because those elections back in the 90s predated the Good Friday Agreement, and the change in governments actually created a momentum around the Good Friday Agreement itself. So there could be some significant changes ahead.
And at the moment, we still have no Stormont, and if the DUP continues to boycott it, do you think there's a plan B?
I think nobody wants there to be a plan B. The problem we have in Northern Ireland is the political structures that were set up in 1998 were very good for the time, but unfortunately, the system has been now distorted in a way where parties can essentially collapse power sharing. And we have seen that being used time and again. There have been 6 collapses since 1998, and the institutions have been down for 40% of their lifetime. So it's quite clear to any objective observer that the structures for Northern Ireland's governance are not working. But there's an aversion to having a conversation about reform at a political level in Dublin and in London. And the challenge we have then is trying to get some kind of normalisation. In terms of Plan B, given the current makeup of Northern Ireland, it would be impossible for there not to be some kind of role for Ireland, for the Irish government. And we did see that from a comment made by the British government in terms of the chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, where he said Plan B would have to involve the Irish government. I think that is probably the most likely outcome.
And what do you think that sort of involvement would look like?
I think it's likely that involvement would take place in the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which does take place already. I think that it would be a case of consulting the Irish government, and that is within the structures of the Good Friday Agreement, so it's not controversial for that to be happening.
And Suzanne Breen said on The View that there was a chance that the Tories could take their foot off the pedal if this situation continues. Will this have any consequences?
I think that the reality is all of this could very quickly change in the next 12 months. We have a current Conservative government that has been pretty damaging for Northern Ireland and doesn't have much regard, frankly, for the Good Friday Agreement kind of structures, and quite clearly has not been effective at trying to get the DUP back into Stormont, despite having a very long, protracted, single-party conversation about doing that. So we have this current structure in place at the moment, but come the elections, it's widely predicted that Labour is going to go into government in the UK. If polls are to be believed, which it's always worth noting that polls are a snapshot in time, and they often do tighten much closer to polling day. But if that happens, the current approach of the Conservative government will frankly be completely for the birds at the moment, because it won't matter. It will be Labour that will go in. So I think there should be perhaps a consideration and a conversation around how will Labour approach Northern Ireland differently than the Conservatives? And do they have the capacity to get Stormont up and running again? Or are we going to have much of the same problem?
How long do you think this whole thing will continue? How many deals do you think it'll take?
I mean, look, Northern Ireland loves a good deal. And if you look at the history over the last 25 years of governance, there is stop-start politics in Northern Ireland. And it often comes with a new agreement that is often the same agreement as before, but slightly reworded. And often the commitments are watered down from previous commitments. And we kind of have this cycle in Northern Ireland of agreements being made, commitments being made, not being delivered, governance collapsing again, and then the whole cycle just restarts. The impact of that actually, I think, has an impact on society as a whole, where we have an electorate and a wider society that is quite disenfranchised, quite fatigued from the fact that we have this kind of stop-start governance structure. And I think there's an issue that we have in trying to re-engage people to engage in the political process and to see that they can ask for more beyond the fact that we have an end to violence in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement. We also do deserve to have a functioning government, and that can be achieved by people going out and using their vote.
And do you think that once the political parties do get back into Stormont, do you think they'll have the motivation to make key decisions?
We have seen at times that when Stormont is up and running, it can be effective. We only had 2 years after New Decade, New Approach, but there was some significant legislation that did get passed during that period. So we know it can work when it's up and running. But I think until the underlying structure, which enables any one party to collapse the institutions, until that is addressed, there is always going to be a risk of further collapse. And even if there is an agreement and the DUP goes back in, or however things are put together in the next 12 months, it will only be temporary unless these underlying issues are addressed. And I think if you go back to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee report, which came out, I believe in December, they did make several recommendations looking at how to reform the institutions, or at least begin a process of reforming the institutions. And that shouldn't be a controversial thing to do, because 25 years is an entire generation. What was good in 1998, for example, the designations, might not necessarily be appropriate today when a majority of people don't identify as unionist or nationalist.
How long can Northern Ireland sort of stand this stop-start politics? How long will it be before the whole thing just buckles?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is we have a lot of fatigue within the electorate, but also a lot of complacency, where this kind of failure of politicians to actually do the job they were elected to do is accepted, or at least tolerated to some degree within society. And I've often thought about what might be the root cause of that tolerance, because if you were to look at, Westminster, if politicians didn't turn up, there would be massive protests against that. Same would be in most Western democracies. So why is it that Northern Ireland's populace just kind of tolerates this lack of political leadership? And I think really it comes down to a feeling that it's better than what we had. So this is so much better than pre-1998, during the conflict. And people have accepted to a large degree that that's good enough. Not having violence, that is a pretty important part of a functioning society. So you can understand why that is so important. But I think that, yes, we have an end to violence, and we now need to look at how we can build on that. And we need to try and get wider society to connect the fact that we are allowed to ask for more here in Northern Ireland. We're allowed to ask for a functioning government. That is also part of the Good Friday Agreement. And we shouldn't be tolerating this kind of political inertia that we're stuck with. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is the longer that we don't have a functioning executive, the more people are interested in alternatives. I did a series of interviews recently, particularly with young people, about how they felt about the lack of power sharing in Northern Ireland. And the general opinion was it made more people think about the possibility of a united Ireland, because they look at what's happening in Dublin and they see a functioning government for a start, and they think, you know what, that looks pretty good. And I think it does create this kind of motivation and momentum around alternatives. Because if Northern Ireland isn't working, people are naturally going to start asking, what can we have instead? And we do have an option of a united Ireland.
And another thing about young people, they're often quite marginalised from politics. So is there anything you would say to any young people?
Yeah, look, it's easy to feel marginalised and disenfranchised when you don't have a political system that's even working. And secondly, you have a lot of political leaders who don't necessarily represent the issues that are important to you, the issues that are impacting your life today. We also don't have enough young people in politics. So it's hard to see your place in that if you don't see it. But my view on political engagement is that the right to vote is a civic duty, not a civic right. And each and every one of us has a responsibility to use that vote. And the only way your voice is going to be heard is if you go out and cast your ballot or find other means of political participation, whether that be through protests, through petitions, through taking up a place in a local society, from being involved in civic society. There's lots of different vehicles for it. But as someone who has worked a lot in the areas of politics and also in the area of civic society, I can tell you it is extraordinarily rewarding to take part in being a member of civic society.
And at the moment, there's actually been a lot of things like the concerns around the climate, and there's the strikes happening, and you would sort of think that would sort of make people want to go back into government.
It's quite clear that the British government is using the strikes and is using the lack of funding for public pay packages as a stick to beat the DUP's back. They're trying to pressurize the DUP back into government, and they're using regular people and public services as a means to do so. And whilst that, from a political point of view, has some merit, because if the British government, the Treasury, gives this money to bring pay packages in line with the rest of the UK, then what's the motivation for the DUP? Okay, so there is some political, I suppose, credence to be given for that approach they're taking. But morally, it's just not right in terms of what it's doing. And I think that we see these large-scale strikes happening because people feel they have no other choice. And we have seen this week from reporting that this approach that the British government is taking of using the strikes, using the pay packages as a means to try and force the DUP back in is not going to work. The DUP have quite clearly made it clear they will not go back in, and they do not see the strikes as something that will motivate them. So it remains to be seen how much longer the Treasury will withhold that money, because they're going to have to do something. Some of the strike action has been really extreme. Some are saying it's the largest day of action in a generation.
And is there anything that could motivate the DUP to go in?
I think Jeffrey Donaldson wanted to go back in last year. I think he has clearly wanted to go back in for quite some time. The issue for the DUP is the party is divided, and it's divided down ideological lines. There are hardliners within the party who it will just never be enough. And it's no coincidence that those are members who are based in Westminster, who do not have to worry about MLA pay cuts and don't have to worry about Stormont not being up and running again. So the issue for Jeffrey Donaldson is, does he have a majority to get through any deal? And is it in the party's best interest to do so? If you look at the recent polling from Lucid Talk, it actually showed the DUP was making ground, being outside of Stormont. I mean, that will motivate people in Jeffrey Donaldson's camp to withhold going back in. And I'm not sure there is motivation for the party to do so before the general election. Because if they do so before the general election and it goes the other way and it negatively impacts them in the polls, they could lose seats. If they just stay where they are now, it seems to be doing okay for them.
And there's a few commentators out there that are saying that this could be Jeffrey Donaldson's Trimble moment. Do you agree with them?
I don't think Jeffrey Donaldson could carry Trimble's tea. Like, you can't compare Trimble and Donaldson, because Trimble, to be fair, he showed immense leadership in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement and took considerable risks, considerable personal risks, to be able to get unionism on board for the Good Friday Agreement. And I don't think that comparison fits. Now, there is some synergy between the fact that, Jeffrey Donaldson is facing an internal revolt, and, Jeffrey left the UUP in opposition to Trimble's position on the Good Friday Agreement. And there would be something something sweet in it if it turned around 25 years later that he ended up having members of his party leave over his position to go back into Stormont. So I think that, yes, there is a considerable challenge for him. He is having to face down a divide in his party in a similar way to Trimble. I just don't think the comparison fits, because the stakes are not as high for Trimble and Jeffrey. Trimble's were much higher. And I think that when it comes down to it, the big difference in the leadership style and the leaders that they are, Jeffrey Donaldson simply is not a strong enough leader. He's not known for being very assertive. So I don't think he really has the cojones to get it through.
And another issue that Jeffrey and all of the politicians will have to face when they return will be the Troubles Legacy Act. Do you think the British government will listen to those here?
No, it's quite clear the British government will not listen to Northern Ireland on the Legacy Act, considering the immense opposition. It's pretty rare we get all parties in Northern Ireland to agree, the major parties, and they did so in opposition to the Legacy Act. Yet Westminster went ahead and passed this through. So I think it's quite clear that the approach of the British government is to protect British soldiers. This legislation is not aimed at protecting victims or their families. It will close off routes to justice. It is not going to be compatible with the ECHR. And I think that that's the issue that will be ahead for the Legacy Act, the case that Ireland is bringing forward, which, it has to be said, is a considerable move by Ireland to take forward this case diplomatically for them to do so, considering that the UK is their closest diplomatic neighbour. But it is necessary because the legislation is not compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So I think the first challenge for the British government legislation will be that case. And if it's ruled against it, I'm not sure how they're going to proceed with keeping it in place. The other question, of course, is the British government's approach to it if Labour goes in. So Labour has said they're going to repeal the Legacy Act if they go into government. I have heard that might not be the case. And in fact, they might just amend the Legacy Act and take away some of the more controversial parts of it. There'll be many people that will say it's completely unsalvageable and the entire act should go. So I think if the Labour Party does keep it in place, that will be a bit of a controversial move. But no, in general, I think there will be no listening to Northern Ireland from the current British government on this act.
And on Thursday, the 11th of January, Sadiq Khan had said that we could be entering a cost of Brexit crisis. And research conducted by the Cambridge Econometrics found the UK's economy figure was shrunk by 140 billion because of leaving the EU. This report claimed the economic damage would continue if the UK stayed outside the single market, predicting it would fall by another 10.1%. But how will this affect Northern Ireland?
Well, I think, wasn't it Jacob Rees-Mogg that said people would feel the benefits of Brexit in 50 years or something like that? But yes, look, we know that Brexit is going to be damaging to the economy. We know it was going to have that impact. In terms of Northern Ireland is safeguarded from some of the larger issues when it comes to Brexit. And that's thanks to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which gives Northern Ireland dual market access to the EU and to the UK. It also has strengthened cross-border linkages, and whilst we have seen significant decreases in the economy in the UK, we have seen less of that happening in Northern Ireland, where it has been boosted in some ways. One area where there has been an increase is in cross-border trade, has seen a significant jump. But also, if you look at some of the shifts in trading, so if you look at the big supermarkets like Tesco and Asda, as a result of Brexit and also the Northern Ireland Protocol, they shifted a lot of their suppliers to be actually local Northern Irish suppliers. So we're seeing big companies like Deli Lights now getting huge contracts with giant supermarkets that previously would have been British sandwiches coming from England being shipped over to Northern Ireland. Now they're being locally sourced. So thankfully, Northern Ireland is safeguarded and blanketed from some of the worst impacts economically as a result of Brexit, and in fact has potential to become really an economic powerhouse. You know, we have some significant financial investment as well in terms of foreign investment as a result of the dual market access. So we do have a lot of potential to, unlike the rest of the UK, potentially even benefit from Brexit.
And Northern Ireland's economic output is now 6.2% above pre-pandemic levels. Its recovery is outpacing the UK as a whole, according to a report by the Northern Ireland Composite Economic Index for Q3 of 2023. So that's also a good sign as well.
It is, yeah. And we do see also a lot of businesses talking about making profits as well. So we do see an increase economically.
So as much as it's interesting to see where Northern Ireland could go, what would you say to any politicians who may be listening?
you can reform how Stormont works. I think that is my biggest message. I think as someone who's analysed the functions of Stormont and how it's operated over the last 25 years, it is quite clear that the current structures are not working. I kind of see the structures as scaffolding. So, they're put in place to stabilise and normalise the idea of working together, the idea of governance in Northern Ireland. But when left too long, they rust. And that's what's happening now. And they jeopardise the entire structure. So that's what we're seeing with the way the structures were put in place in 1998. And there has to be a serious conversation held about how we can modernise structures to make them more stable. And I think that all parties have to be involved in that process. But I also favour, I should say, a civic element to it as well. I don't think that it's enough for there to be closed multi-party talks about potential Stormont reform. I think wider society has to have a voice in this too. And in New Decade, New Approach, there was a commitment to have one citizens' assembly in Northern Ireland every year. There hasn't been any yet, but this would be, I think, a perfect vehicle for civic society and wider society to have a conversation around Stormont reform. Is a perfect space to put it into a citizens' assembly. And I think that might give some credence to some of the recommendations being made by some parties, such as, for example, the Alliance Party recommendation of if one party opts out, it should go to the next largest party. I don't find too many people that disagree with that idea. So I think that that's what I would say. We have to look at how do we get stable governance. If we keep doing the same thing again, we're only going to see Stormont collapse. So we have to look at how to modernise them.
Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Till next time, stay tuned and we'll talk later.